Europe never expected to wake up one morning and realize it was no longer the center of the world. For decades, politicians and economists insisted that the European Union would always control the future of global trade, technology, and development. But while Europe clung to the past, China and Africa quietly built the future together. New factories rose in nations once ignored by the world. Railways cut across deserts. Satellites launched from equatorial bases, and entire supply chains shifted away from European dependence.
In 2002, after the end of the 27-year-long civil war in Angola, the only country willing to come to the aid of Angola was China. In fact, the West considered Angola as a risky and uncertain investment. But China, which at the time needed oil for its economy, saw potential and opportunities in the oil-rich Angola.
By the time Brussels noticed, the world economy no longer needed Europe to function. The power it spent centuries accumulating had evaporated in less than a decade, not through war, but through partnerships it never saw coming. And now, as China and Africa shape a new world order, Europe faces a terrifying truth. Survival is no longer guaranteed.
Western countries are being pushed out of West and Central Africa as other world players gain influence there. That's the message from the EU's Military Staff Director General, who's raised concerns over Europe potentially losing access to the continent's resources.
We are more or less pushed out many Western countries, including US, from Niger, from Mali, from Burkina Faso, from other countries. And this will cause problems for the future if we don't act. So we are thinking about an integrated approach to step up our efforts in Africa. And especially this approach will be that we will support them in a way that they ask for, instead of bringing them good, like we did in the past.
But the truth is, it's a million miles from the reality of EU-Africa trade policy as it exists now. Because our economic relations with Africa are simply a continuation of European colonialism, perpetuating exploitation by other means. Africa trades more with Europe than it does with itself. It's portrayed as a poor continent, but actually it's the richest.
Think about the Sahel region. One of the poorest, yet fastest growing demographically. The succession of military coups will make the region more unstable for years ahead. Russia is both influencing and benefiting from the crisis, and the region has become fertile ground to the rise of terrorism. This is of direct concern for Europe, for our security and our prosperity. So we need to show the same unity of purpose towards Africa as we have shown towards Ukraine. This is a must. We need to focus on cooperation with legitimate governments and regional organizations. We need to develop a mutually beneficial partnership which focuses on common issues for Europe and Africa. And this is why, together with HRVP Borrell, we will work on a new strategic approach to take forward at the next EU-AU summit.
The warning signs were there long before Europe admitted it. Cargo reports shifting direction, investment flows bypassing Brussels, and military cooperation treaties quietly dissolving across Africa. Yet European leaders continued to speak as if the world still revolved around their decisions, their markets, their influence. They did not realize that while they debated policies in Strasbourg and Brussels, China and Africa were building something far more powerful than a trade agreement. They were building a new global center of gravity. It began with small gestures, infrastructure deals in Kenya, digital network expansions in South Africa, and mining partnerships in Angola. But what looked like scattered cooperation soon revealed itself as a unified strategy. China wasn't merely investing in Africa. It was helping the continent industrialize. Highways, ports, logistics hubs, solar grids, and tech zones emerged in places that Europe once expected to remain dependent. And as Africa rose, China rose with it, not as a master, but as a partner. Europe watched with irritation rather than fear. EU officials claimed that Africa would always rely on European markets. They told themselves that Beijing's money would eventually drain away. They convinced themselves that cultural ties and language would keep Africa aligned with Europe forever. Then the first shock broke the illusion. Multiple African nations announced that key natural resources would no longer be exported raw. Minerals needed for electric vehicles, cobalt for batteries, bauxite for aluminum, and rare earth elements crucial for wind turbines and microchips would be processed on African soil before leaving the continent. The decision was not made in Paris or Berlin, it was made in Abuja, Kinshasa, Addis Ababa, and Accra. Factories funded by China were already being built. Europe had no say. For the first time in decades, the supply chain flowed south and east instead of north. China and Africa weren't only reshaping global production, they were reshaping global power. The new manufacturing plants in Tanzania and Morocco weren't servicing Europe first. Their priority markets were Shanghai, Riyadh, Jakarta, and Sao Paulo. Europe was becoming an afterthought. The reaction inside EU headquarters bordered on disbelief. Reports showed that over 70% of critical minerals used in European clean energy manufacturing were now controlled by joint Chinese-African ventures. Automotive companies in Germany panicked. Tech firms in the Netherlands issued warnings to investors. Energy ministers in France demanded emergency meetings. But the crisis wasn't only economic, it was psychological. Europe had always defined its role in the world as the wise teacher, the benevolent advisor, the center of diplomacy and trade. But suddenly, two regions that Europe once viewed as inferior were writing the rules, and they weren't asking Europe to approve them. Then came the announcement that shocked the Union more than any tariff or shortage. China and Africa unveiled a joint digital currency for trade settlement, eliminating reliance on the euro and the dollar. The currency wasn't global, but it didn't need to be. It covered enough trade to change everything. Africa would no longer borrow in euros. China would no longer need European banks as middlemen. A financial era ended quietly in the back rooms of Nairobi and Beijing. The true panic in Europe started when the Union finally understood the deeper strategy. China wasn't building influence in Africa. China was building independence from Europe and helping Africa do the same. Europe tried to respond. It offered new development packages, new student visas, new climate investments, and new peacekeeping partnerships. But Africa's memory ran long. Leaders across the continent asked why Europe only became generous after losing power. The old political charm no longer worked. Africa now had options, and China offered respect instead of lectures. The next blow came from Asia. Factories in China began relocating not back to Europe, but to Africa. The labor was young, skilled, and growing. The continent had something Europe lacked: a rising generation. Suddenly, African-made cars, electronics, batteries, pharmaceuticals, and even aircraft parts began entering global markets with price tags Europe could not compete with. African products flooded South American and Middle Eastern markets, while China provided the supply chain expertise, logistics, and technology. Europe's worst fear had come true. Africa was no longer the resource exporter and customer, it was becoming a competitor. Turbulence shook the European economy. Unemployment rose in manufacturing sectors. Farmers protested as African and Chinese food processing giants entered the same markets Brussels once dominated. Ports in Greece and Italy reported declining shipping contracts. Protests erupted across France demanding protectionism and higher tariffs, but nothing could stop what had already begun. The partnership between China and Africa did not need Europe. It did not even think about Europe. It moved forward with its own momentum, self-reinforcing, self-expanding, self-confident. In one closed-door session, an EU analyst summed up the crisis in a single sentence. We didn't lose Africa, and we didn't lose China. We lost the assumption that the world couldn't function without us. The shift was irreversible. Europe's era of dictating the global economic order was ending, not because anyone attacked it, but because two rising powers simply built something better. The panic inside Europe didn't explode all at once. It crept in quietly, disguised as subtle warnings from economists, nervous whispers from industrial CEOs, and a sharp decline in confidence across the stock markets. What began as a resource and manufacturing setback evolved into something far more dangerous: a geopolitical identity crisis. Europe had always defined itself as the future. Clean energy, luxury goods, automotive engineering, aerospace technology, these were the pillars of its global prestige. But the world was changing faster than the Union could adapt. China controlled the supply chains, Africa controlled the raw materials, and increasingly the manufacturing. The industries that once gave Europe power were dissolving in real time. Two events pushed the crisis past denial. The first came when Germany's largest electric vehicle manufacturer, long dependent on cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo, announced it could not secure the mineral at competitive prices anymore. The new joint African-Chinese Energy Alliance granted priority access to Asian companies, Middle Eastern partners, and regional African processors. European firms were told they could still buy, but no longer at privileged rates or in unlimited quantities. The second came when Europe attempted a diplomatic backlash, a high-level EU delegation traveled to Kenya, South Africa, and Nigeria, hoping to negotiate exclusive trade deals to counterbalance Chinese influence. What they encountered instead was unity. African leaders politely declined to sign agreements that would isolate China or restrict African partnerships. They did not threaten Europe. They simply didn't need it. From that moment, the illusion of control began to collapse. News outlets across the continent debated the same question: what happens if Europe is no longer at the center of the world? Some framed the crisis as a temporary shift, others feared an irreversible decline, but the most alarming voices were the quiet experts who warned that Europe had become dependent on global systems it no longer led energy imports. Technology imports and aging populations that could not sustain industrial growth without external support. Then came the turning point, the Beijing-Addis Ababa Declaration. In a broadcast watched across the world, China and Africa jointly announced three sweeping initiatives: a transcontinental industrial belt across Africa with tax-free zones for manufacturing, a development fund for African startups using Chinese technology, and Capital A Logistics Pact that guaranteed priority shipping between African and Asian ports. None of the initiatives mentioned Europe even once. Europe wasn't an enemy, it was irrelevant. Brussels immediately accused China of trying to destabilize global markets. African governments responded with calm clarity. Africa was stabilizing itself. The Union had no counter-argument. The next blow came from the global marketplace. International corporations raced to relocate factories to Africa not out of charity, but out of pure financial logic. Wages were lower than in Europe, infrastructure was improving faster than anywhere else on Earth, and access to minerals and logistics hubs was unmatched. Companies that didn't move risked becoming obsolete. European workers watched as factories closed or downsized. Cities once proud of their industrial heritage turned anxious. Politicians promised stimulus programs and subsidies, but no amount of funding could replace the gravitational pull of the joint China-Africa ecosystem. The crisis was no longer just economic, it was cultural. For generations, Europe had convinced itself that modernization flowed outward from its borders, but the new era was flowing around Europe, not through it. African engineers were creating breakthrough software systems without coding schools in Paris. Chinese mega-projects set new global standards without consulting Brussels. Startups from Nairobi, Lagos, and Accra were partnering with Asian venture capital, not European banks. The idea that Europe was the intellectual guardian of development had evaporated. Behind closed doors, EU security experts warned of something even greater. If economic collapse accelerated, it would trigger political fragmentation. Nations already arguing over migration, budgets, and energy policy would tear further apart under the pressure of unemployment and industrial decline. There would be protests, nationalism, and potentially political extremism. And while Europe fought internally, China and Africa would advance undistracted. The relationship between Beijing and African capitals did not operate like old colonial deals. It worked through mutual interest. China needed Africa for resources, markets, and geopolitical reach. Africa needed China for infrastructure, investment, and accelerated development. The more Europe attacked the relationship publicly, the stronger it became privately. For the first time since the industrial era, the world economy was being shaped without European fingerprints. The alarm peaked when a leaked economic projection appeared in the media. According to the document, if current trends continued, Africa would surpass the EU in GDP growth rate, manufacturing output, and population-driven labor productivity by the early 2040s. China had already surpassed Europe in manufacturing, innovation spending, and export share. The report's final line struck Europe's core. The Union is at risk of becoming the world's first post-industrial civilization, not because it evolved beyond industry, but because industry evolved beyond it. In parliaments across the continent, the debate split into two irreconcilable visions: fight China and Africa through sanctions and geopolitical pressure, or accept the new order and negotiate from a position of humility. Neither strategy promised victory because the real danger for Europe wasn't China alone, it wasn't Africa alone, it was the fact that this time they were rising together.